Ladies and gentlemen, a fed-up empath is not dangerous because they become cruel. They are dangerous because they finally become clear. Clarity is a force that reshapes destiny. When a person who once tolerated pain begins to recognize their value, they no longer negotiate with disrespect. They do not need loud confrontations, dramatic exits, or public declarations. Their transformation happens internally, and that is where the greatest revolutions always begin. An empath's strength is often misunderstood because it does not usually arrive with noise, dominance, or visible force. It is quiet, observant, and deeply rooted in awareness, which makes it easy for others to mistake it for weakness. Yet true strength is not measured by how loudly someone speaks or how aggressively they act. It is measured by how deeply they understand, how patiently they endure, and how wisely they respond. An empath possesses an unusual ability to sense emotional undercurrents, to read intentions behind words, and to feel the unspoken tensions in a room. This sensitivity is not fragility, it is a refined perception that many people never develop. However, when this gift is constantly exploited, dismissed, or manipulated, the empath eventually reaches a point where their kindness is no longer automatic. This is not because their heart becomes cold, but because their mind becomes clear. Strength that has been tested repeatedly becomes disciplined. The empath who has experienced betrayal, emotional exhaustion, and disappointment does not suddenly lose compassion. Instead, they gain discernment. Discernment is the mature form of empathy. It is empathy guided by wisdom rather than impulse. At this stage, the empath learns that understanding others does not mean tolerating abuse, and loving people does not mean sacrificing self-respect. This realization marks a powerful internal shift. The empath stops asking, "How can I fix this person?" and begins asking, "Is this environment healthy for me?" That single change in question transforms their entire direction in life. Hidden strength often reveals itself through restraint rather than reaction. Many assume power is displayed through confrontation, but there is a greater power in choosing not to engage with negativity. The empath's strength is their ability to walk away without hatred, to release without revenge, and to detach without losing their humanity. This level of emotional control requires far more courage than anger ever will. Anger is immediate and impulsive. Emotional discipline is deliberate and intentional. When an empath reaches this level, their silence carries meaning, their distance communicates boundaries, and their calmness unsettles those who once relied on provoking them. Education teaches that awareness is the foundation of intelligent action. In emotional life, the empath already holds advanced awareness, but the lesson they must learn is self-valuation. Once they recognize that their empathy is valuable, they stop distributing it without consideration. They begin to invest it where it is reciprocated and appreciated. This does not make them selfish, it makes them balanced. Balance is essential because unbalanced empathy leads to burnout, resentment, and loss of identity. Balanced empathy, on the other hand, produces confidence, clarity, and emotional independence. Another dimension of this hidden strength is the empath's capacity for endurance. They often withstand situations longer than most people could tolerate, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they believe in potential and growth. Yet endurance must eventually be paired with boundaries, or it becomes self-neglect. When the empath learns to say no without guilt, they unlock a new level of power. The word no becomes a shield protecting their peace, their time, and their energy. Energy is one of the most precious human resources, and those who learn to guard it shape their lives with greater precision and purpose. There is also a transformative moment when the empath realizes they are not responsible for everyone's healing. This realization lifts an invisible burden from their shoulders. They understand that support does not mean self-sacrifice and that compassion does not require constant availability. In this freedom, their strength becomes visible not through force, but through stability. They no longer chase validation, nor do they fear abandonment, because they have built an internal foundation of self-worth. A person who values themselves becomes emotionally unshakable, and this stability influences every decision they make. Ultimately, the empath's hidden strength is their ability to remain kind without being naive, to remain open without being vulnerable to exploitation, and to remain loving without losing themselves. This strength is quiet but unbreakable, gentle but firm, and patient but decisive. It is the strength of someone who understands emotions yet is not controlled by them, someone who forgives but does not forget lessons, and someone who cares deeply while still protecting their inner peace. When this strength is recognized and nurtured, the empath evolves into a person who leads with wisdom, chooses with intention, and lives with authenticity. Such strength does not need to be announced. because its impact is felt in every room they enter and in every life they touch. Continuous emotional exploitation does something profound to a person who once operated from pure understanding and limitless patience. At first, the empath believes that endurance is strength. They convince themselves that giving more love, more time, and more understanding will eventually correct the imbalance. They assume that if they can just explain better, listen longer, or forgive deeper, harmony will return. But emotional exploitation is not corrected by increased generosity. It is often encouraged by it. The empath slowly realizes that their kindness has been interpreted not as grace, but as permission. This realization is not instant. It is a gradual awakening formed through repeated disappointment, broken promises, and the exhausting cycle of hope followed by hurt. Each incident becomes a lesson. Each lesson becomes awareness, and awareness eventually becomes a boundary. A boundary is not anger, it is clarity expressed through action. When patience is stretched beyond its healthy limit, it does not transform into hatred, it transforms into firmness. The empath begins to understand that saying no is not cruelty, walking away is not betrayal, and protecting their peace is not selfishness. Education in emotional maturity teaches that endurance without limits is self-abandonment. The empath who once feared confrontation now recognizes that silence in the face of disrespect is a deeper form of harm. Therefore, they start to speak with calm authority rather than emotional desperation. Their tone changes, their posture changes, and their choices change. They do not need to shout because certainty has replaced confusion. Emotional exploitation once kept them trapped in cycles of justification, but boundaries free them from the need to justify their worth. This shift is powerful because it redirects their energy inward. Instead of constantly repairing others, they begin repairing themselves. Instead of absorbing negativity, they filter it. Instead of negotiating their value, they embody it. The world often misunderstands this transformation, labeling it as coldness or distance, but in reality it is discipline. Discipline of the heart is one of the highest forms of intelligence. It allows compassion to exist without self-destruction. When an empath reaches this point, they do not lose their kindness. They refine it. They choose where it flows, whom it serves, and when it must stop. What once looked like endless tolerance becomes intentional interaction. The person who exploited their patience suddenly finds no entry point, no emotional leverage, and no access to the same reactions that once fed their control. The empath has not changed into someone unrecognizable. They have simply removed the door that allowed repeated harm. In doing so, they discover that boundaries are not walls that isolate them from the world, but gates that protect their inner peace. A fed-up empath stops seeking approval and starts honoring self-respect. And this transition is one of the most liberating psychological evolutions a person can experience. Approval seeking often begins innocently. The empath wants harmony, acceptance, and reassurance that their presence is valued. They measure their success by how comfortable others feel around them. Over time, this habit becomes a silent dependency. They start adjusting their words to avoid conflict, altering their opinions to maintain connection, and minimizing their needs to keep relationships intact. This constant adjustment slowly erodes identity. The empath may not notice it immediately, but they begin living as a reflection of others rather than an expression of themselves. The moment of change arrives when exhaustion outweighs fear. They recognize that approval is temporary, inconsistent, and often conditional. While self-respect is stable and internally generated, this awareness acts like a mental reset. They begin asking different questions, not will they accept me, but do I accept this situation? This reversal of perspective is transformative because it restores personal authority. Self-respect is not arrogance. It is alignment between values and actions. When an empath embraces self-respect, they stop apologizing for existing, for needing rest, for having standards, or for choosing solitude. They no longer chase validation from people who withhold it as a form of control. Instead, they cultivate internal validation through reflection, learning, and self-discipline. Education plays a critical role here because understanding emotional patterns gives them language for what they once only felt. Knowledge turns confusion into comprehension, and comprehension builds confidence. Confidence then shapes behavior. The empath becomes less reactive and more intentional. They do not rush to please, they pause to evaluate. They do not overextend, they prioritize sustainability. Relationships become choices rather than obligations. This change often surprises those who benefited from their former compliance. Because the empath's new posture cannot be manipulated by guilt or pressure. Their communication becomes concise, their presence becomes calm, and their absence becomes meaningful. Honoring self-respect also strengthens resilience. The empath learns that disagreement does not equal rejection, and that walking away from disrespect is not failure but wisdom. They develop the courage to disappoint others when necessary, understanding that pleasing everyone is impossible, but respecting oneself is essential. Over time, this mindset creates emotional independence. Independence does not eliminate compassion, it purifies it. The empath continues to care deeply, but their care is no longer a sacrifice of identity. They stand firm without hostility, speak truth without aggression, and offer kindness without surrendering dignity. In this state, approval becomes a bonus rather than a necessity, and self-respect becomes the foundation upon which every decision is built. A moment comes in the life of a deeply compassionate person when exhaustion is no longer physical but emotional, when the heart grows tired not from loving but from being taken for granted. This turning point is not loud, dramatic, or filled with anger. It is quiet, steady, and transformative. The individual who once bent over backward to maintain peace suddenly realizes that peace built on self-neglect is not peace at all. Seeking approval once felt necessary because validation seemed like oxygen, but with maturity comes the understanding that oxygen was always within. The shift begins internally, where self-respect slowly rises like the sun after a long night. It does not rush, it does not demand attention, yet it changes everything it touches. The empath who reaches this realization stops measuring their worth through the reactions of others and starts measuring it through their own sense of dignity. This is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is the recognition that kindness should never be currency for acceptance and that genuine relationships do not require self-sacrifice as an entrance fee. As this transformation unfolds, behavior changes in subtle yet powerful ways. The empath no longer over-explains their feelings to those committed to misunderstanding them. They stop volunteering their energy to people who only appear during moments of convenience. Their conversations become clearer, their no becomes firm without being cruel, and their silence becomes intentional rather than fearful. Approval once acted like a mirror in which they searched for identity, but now identity is an internal compass guiding every step. They learn that constantly seeking permission to exist is a form of self-imprisonment, and breaking free does not require rebellion, it requires realization. This realization brings calm confidence. It teaches them that disagreement does not equal rejection, and that being disliked for honesty is far healthier than being loved for compliance. In this state, the empath becomes emotionally self-reliant, discovering that respect from others is a reflection, not a foundation. The true foundation is the respect they cultivate within themselves. Honoring self-respect also changes the standards they set for their environment. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls to shut people out, but doors that decide who may enter and under what conditions. Instead of asking, "How can I make them stay?" the question becomes, "Do they deserve to stay?" This reversal is powerful because it shifts authority back to the one who once felt powerless. The empath stops chasing closure from those who refuse accountability and instead grants closure to themselves through acceptance and forward movement. They recognize that self-respect is expressed not only through what they say, but through what they tolerate. Tolerance, once unlimited, now becomes selective and wise. They realize that emotional generosity must be balanced with discernment. Forgiving without limits eventually leads to depletion. With self-respect as their guide, generosity becomes intentional rather than compulsive, and relationships become choices rather than obligations. This evolution does not strip away compassion, it refines it. The empath still cares, still understands, still feels deeply, but those feelings are no longer exploited because they are anchored in self-awareness. Honoring self-respect teaches them to distinguish between empathy and enabling, between patience and passivity, between forgiveness and repeated exposure to harm. They learn that protecting their peace is not selfish, it is responsible. Just as a teacher cannot educate without knowledge, a giver cannot give without emotional resources. Self-respect becomes the well that continually replenishes those resources. Without it, kindness dries into resentment. With it, kindness flows freely without fear of exploitation. Ultimately, the empath who stops seeking approval and begins honoring self-respect experiences a liberation that is both quiet and profound. Their confidence is no longer dependent on applause. Their joy no longer hinges on acceptance, and their direction no longer shifts with every opinion. They walk into rooms not to be noticed, but to be authentic. They speak not to impress, but to express truth. This transformation influences every aspect of life. Relationships become healthier, decisions become clearer, And the future becomes brighter because it is no longer negotiated through insecurity. The individual who once feared losing others discovers that the greatest victory is no longer losing themselves. In honoring self-respect, they do not become distant or cold. They become grounded, balanced, and emotionally sovereign. And a person who stands firmly in self-respect carries a presence that requires no approval, commands no attention, yet naturally earns both. An empath's strength is often misunderstood because it does not announce itself with noise or dominance. It operates quietly, like deep roots beneath a tall tree. People often mistake kindness for weakness because they measure power by volume instead of by endurance. Yet the empath carries an internal resilience built from emotional awareness, patience, and the ability to endure discomfort without losing humanity. This strength is not aggressive, but it is unbreakable when awakened. The individual who has spent years understanding others develops a profound understanding of themselves as well, even if that awareness comes later in life. When they finally recognize that their compassion has value, their entire posture toward the world changes. They no longer shrink to make others comfortable, nor do they feel obligated to explain their worth. The same heart that once forgave endlessly begins to protect itself wisely. This transformation does not remove their kindness, it refines it. Strength in an empath is the ability to remain gentle without being naive, to stay open without being unguarded, and to care deeply without allowing that care to be exploited. It is the realization that empathy is not submission, it is perception combined with courage. Continuous emotional exploitation eventually creates a turning point where patience evolves into boundaries. Patience is a beautiful quality, but when it is repeatedly abused, it becomes a lesson rather than a virtue. An empath often gives chances because they believe in growth, healing, and second opportunities. However, repeated disappointment becomes a teacher that speaks louder than promises. The mind begins to analyze patterns instead of isolated incidents. The heart, once quick to excuse, starts to question consistency. This shift is not bitterness, it is maturity. Boundaries are not walls built out of anger, but fences built out of wisdom. They are not meant to keep love out. They are designed to keep harm from entering freely. When an empath learns to say no without guilt, they step into a new level of personal authority. They begin to understand that protecting their peace is not selfish but necessary. The emotional energy they once invested blindly becomes intentional. They start to evaluate relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional history. This is the moment when endurance turns into discernment, and discernment becomes empowerment. The individual realizes that forgiveness does not require continued access, and compassion does not require continuous sacrifice. The creation of boundaries is the birth of emotional independence. A fed-up empath eventually stops seeking approval and begins honoring self-respect. And this shift alters every interaction they have. Approval-seeking often grows from a desire to maintain harmony, but harmony built on self-neglect is fragile and exhausting. The empath, who once measured their value by how needed or appreciated they felt, starts measuring it by how aligned they are with their principles. This is a profound psychological change because it moves motivation from external validation to internal conviction. When self-respect becomes the foundation, decisions are no longer made out of fear of rejection. The individual becomes less reactive and more intentional. Conversations change tone, relationships change dynamics, and even silence gains power. They no longer explain their feelings or apologize for their boundaries. Instead, they speak with calm certainty or choose not to engage at all. This self-respect also influences the type of environments they tolerate. Toxic familiarity loses its comfort, and healthy unfamiliarity becomes attractive. The empath learns that being liked is not the same as being valued, and being valued is not the same as valuing oneself. Once this realization settles in, they stop negotiating their dignity for temporary peace. Their confidence does not become arrogance, it becomes stability. People around them sense this change because it removes the possibility of manipulation. Approval is replaced by authenticity, and authenticity cannot be easily shaken. Silence, for the awakened empath, is not surrender but recalibration. Many interpret silence as weakness or defeat because they equate expression with strength. However, silence can be one of the most strategic forms of communication. It allows reflection, emotional regulation, and the gathering of clarity before action. When an empath chooses silence, they are not retreating from reality, they are reorganizing their inner world. They are observing patterns, reassessing priorities, and conserving emotional energy that was once spent on unnecessary conflict. Silence creates space where emotions can settle and logic can emerge. It prevents impulsive reactions and replaces them with thoughtful responses or purposeful detachment. In this quiet state, the empath regains control over their narrative. They are no longer pulled into every argument or drained by every demand. Instead, they become selective with their attention, understanding that attention is a limited resource. This recalibration also strengthens intuition, allowing them to sense intentions more accurately and respond with wisdom rather than emotion. Silence teaches them that not every battle deserves participation, and not every voice deserves an answer. Through silence, they rediscover their center, and from that center comes clarity, confidence, and direction. It is not an escape from confrontation, but a preparation for purposeful living. When they finally speak or act after this period of recalibration, their words carry weight because they are no longer driven by frustration, but by understanding. Silence becomes their sanctuary, their strategy, and their source of renewed strength. An empath's strength is often misunderstood because it is wrapped in gentleness, patience, and emotional openness. Many people mistake calmness for weakness and kindness for lack of power, but true strength is the ability to remain compassionate in a world that constantly tests your heart. An empath carries emotional endurance that most people never develop. They listen when others are tired of hearing, they forgive when others are eager to judge, and they understand when others rush to conclusions. This emotional depth is not accidental, it is cultivated through experience, reflection, and a sincere desire to create harmony. However, strength that is repeatedly tested begins to transform. The empath who has been pushed beyond their limits discovers that their kindness was never the absence of power, it was controlled power. When they realize this truth, their presence shifts from accommodating to intentional. They no longer allow their empathy to be exploited. And this realization alone changes how they walk, how they speak, and how they allow others to treat them. Continuous emotional exploitation slowly reshapes a person's inner world. At first, the empath gives the benefit of the doubt, believing that understanding and patience will eventually inspire change. They extend grace repeatedly, hoping their love will be mirrored back. But repeated disappointment teaches lessons that no book or lecture can deliver. Each ignored boundary, each broken promise, and each act of manipulation becomes a chapter in their emotional education. Over time, patience is no longer passive endurance. It becomes informed awareness. The empath begins to notice patterns instead of excuses. They start to recognize that empathy without boundaries is self-neglect. This realization is not born from anger, but from clarity. The emotional exploitation that once drained them becomes the very force that awakens their sense of self-protection. They learn that compassion must walk hand in hand with accountability, and that allowing disrespect is not kindness, it is permission for harm. A fed-up empath eventually stops seeking approval and begins honoring self-respect. This shift is profound because approval seeking is often tied to the fear of rejection or abandonment. The empath once believed that maintaining peace required personal sacrifice, but experience teaches them that peace built on self-betrayal is temporary and hollow. Self-respect emerges when they understand that their worth is not dependent on external validation. They begin to ask different questions instead of, how can I keep everyone comfortable? They ask, what aligns with my values and well-being? This mental transition changes their decisions. They speak more honestly, they decline invitations that drain them, and they distance themselves from environments that demand emotional labor without reciprocity. Self-respect becomes their internal compass, guiding them toward relationships that are mutual rather than one-sided. The empath does not lose their kindness, they refine it. They learn that saying no can be an act of integrity, and choosing themselves is not selfish, it is necessary for sustainable generosity. Emotional intelligence, when combined with repeated disappointment, evolves into strategic awareness. An empath naturally reads emotions, understands subtle cues, and senses shifts in behavior. When trust is broken multiple times, this emotional intelligence sharpens. They no longer interpret actions solely through optimism, they integrate observation and reason. This does not make them cynical, it makes them discerning. They become skilled at identifying manipulation, inconsistency, and insincerity without needing confrontation. Their awareness becomes proactive rather than reactive. They begin to prepare emotionally instead of being caught off guard. This strategic awareness protects their peace because they anticipate behaviors rather than being surprised by them. It also allows them to invest their time and energy wisely. Instead of trying to fix every situation, they recognize which circumstances deserve effort and which require distance. Emotional intelligence matures into wisdom, and wisdom grants them the power to choose environments where their empathy is valued rather than exploited. Silence becomes one of the empath's most powerful tools when they are fed up. In the past, they may have used words to explain, defend, or clarify their intentions repeatedly. But maturity teaches them that not every situation deserves a response. Silence is no longer a sign of defeat. It is a deliberate pause that protects emotional energy. Through silence, they observe more clearly and react less impulsively. This quiet strength unsettles those who once relied on provoking reactions, because the absence of response removes the emotional leverage they once had. Silence allows the empath to process feelings without external pressure, to step back from chaos, and to regain perspective. It becomes a space where healing occurs and decisions are made with clarity rather than emotion. In this silence, they rediscover their identity beyond the expectations of others. They learn that they do not owe constant explanations, and that peace often grows in the absence of unnecessary noise. This recalibration is not withdrawal from life, it is alignment with purpose. A conscious decision to protect their inner world so that their outer actions are guided by wisdom instead of wounds. An empath's strength is often misunderstood because it does not always appear loud, dominant, or forceful. It is quiet, observant, and deeply rooted in emotional awareness. Many people confuse gentleness with weakness, but true empathy requires immense inner stability. To consistently understand others, absorb emotional environments, and still function with kindness is not a small ability, it is a form of endurance that many cannot sustain. The empath sees beneath words, recognizes hidden pain, and often chooses peace over pride. This repeated choice builds an invisible resilience. Over time, this resilience becomes a silent power. When an empath finally decides they have tolerated enough, that same emotional depth that once nurtured others now becomes the foundation of self-protection. The strength that was once used to forgive becomes the strength used to walk away. It is not anger that fuels this change, but realization. And realization, once awakened, cannot easily be reversed. Continuous emotional exploitation slowly transforms patience into boundaries. Patience is often celebrated, but when it is abused, it begins to erode the spirit. The empath initially gives chances, then explanations, then silence, hoping situations will improve. However, repeated disappointment teaches a lesson that kindness alone cannot fix every relationship. Boundaries are born not from bitterness, but from accumulated wisdom. They are not walls meant to isolate, they are filters meant to protect. A fed-up empath does not suddenly become cold, they become selective. They understand that energy is limited and that where it is invested determines emotional health. This shift is educational in nature, like a student finally understanding a complex lesson after repeated failures. The empath learns that unlimited access invites unlimited harm. Once this lesson is fully absorbed, their interactions change. They begin to respond instead of react, to evaluate instead of excuse, and to prioritize peace over pleasing others. A fed-up empath stops seeking approval and starts honoring self-respect. Approval is a powerful addiction because it ties self-worth to external opinions. Empaths, due to their caring nature, often fall into the trap of wanting harmony so badly that they sacrifice their own needs. Over time, this creates imbalance. The turning point arrives when they realize that constant self-sacrifice does not guarantee appreciation. In fact, it often attracts those who expect more while giving less. Self-respect emerges as a corrective force. It is the moment the empath understands that being valued by everyone is less important than valuing themselves. This internal shift changes posture, tone, and decisions. They no longer apologize for setting limits or feel guilty for choosing rest over obligation. Their confidence does not come from dominance, but from alignment with their inner truth. When approval loses its grip, freedom takes its place, and a free mind cannot be easily manipulated. Emotional intelligence evolves into strategic awareness when trust is repeatedly broken. Emotional intelligence allows an empath to read moods and intentions, but experience refines this ability into discernment. Trust, once shattered multiple times, becomes a teacher. The empath begins to recognize patterns instead of isolated incidents. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions, promises and outcomes, affection and respect. This awareness is not paranoia, it is informed observation. Just as education sharpens the mind through repetition and reflection, emotional experiences sharpen intuition. The empath learns to ask better questions internally, to analyze behavior rather than cling to hope alone. This does not remove compassion, it balances it with caution. Strategic awareness means they can still care deeply while protecting themselves from emotional exploitation. It is the maturity of knowing that understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating their harm. Silence from an empath is not surrender, it is recalibration. Many interpret silence as weakness, defeat, or fear, but for an empath it often represents processing and realignment. When overwhelmed, they withdraw not to escape responsibility, but to regain clarity. Silence becomes a workshop where thoughts are organized, emotions are filtered, and decisions are refined. In this quiet space, they reconnect with their values and reassess their priorities. It is similar to an athlete stepping back to regain breath before returning stronger. The absence of words does not mean the absence of strength. It often signals preparation. During this recalibration, the empath learns to separate what they feel from what they must tolerate. They discover that not every battle deserves participation and not every voice deserves response. Their silence becomes a form of communication more powerful than arguments because it denies drama the attention it seeks. Detachment becomes the empath's shield when compassion has been repeatedly abused. Detachment is often mistaken for indifference, yet in reality is controlled emotional distance. It allows the empath to remain kind without becoming consumed. When compassion is exploited, constant closeness becomes dangerous to mental well-being. Detachment restores balance. It is the understanding that caring for others should never require abandoning oneself. This shield does not eliminate empathy, it organizes it. The empath still wishes well, still hopes for growth in others, but no longer feels obligated to fix every situation. They learn that responsibility for another person's behavior does not belong to them. This realization is liberating. It transforms emotional chaos into calm observation. Through detachment, the empath protects their peace while preserving their humanity. They do not become less loving, they become wisely loving, directing their energy where it is reciprocated and respected. The empath understands people deeply, and this depth of understanding is what makes their withdrawal so powerful. An empath is naturally observant. They notice tone shifts, subtle facial expressions, pauses in conversations, and emotional inconsistencies that most people overlook. This awareness is not learned overnight, but developed through years of listening more than speaking, feeling more than reacting, and giving more than receiving. Because of this, the empath builds an internal map of human behavior. They know when someone is being genuine and when someone is pretending. They can sense when apologies lack sincerity and when affection is simply a strategy. For a long time, this understanding is used to forgive, to justify, and to keep relationships intact. However, when an empath becomes fed up, this same understanding transforms from tolerance into precision. When the empath decides to step back, it is not an emotional outburst. It is a calculated emotional decision rooted in clarity. They do not withdraw impulsively. They withdraw after patterns have been observed repeatedly, after chances have been given generously, and after hope has been extended beyond reasonable limits. This is why their departure carries such weight. It is not dramatic, yet it is final. The people around them often feel confused because the empath did not shout, threaten, or create chaos. Instead, they simply became unavailable. Their messages grow shorter, their presence becomes rare, and their emotional openness closes like a door that no longer wishes to be knocked on. This quiet distancing is impactful because it removes the emotional access others had grown dependent on. The empath's understanding of people also means they know exactly what their absence will communicate. They recognize that silence can deliver a message louder than confrontation. They know that when they stop explaining themselves, the other person is forced to reflect. The empath does not need revenge because awareness itself becomes their shield. They are no longer naive about intentions, and once innocence is replaced with insight, manipulation loses its power. This is why their withdrawal feels dangerous to those who relied on their endless patience. The empath has not changed their nature, they have changed their boundaries. They still care, but they no longer sacrifice themselves to prove it. Another significant element is emotional memory. Empaths remember how situations made them feel, not just what happened. They remember the exhaustion after trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. They remember the sleepless nights caused by overthinking conversations and the emotional weight of carrying other people's burdens. When they withdraw, they are not running away, they are choosing emotional safety. Their understanding of people allows them to predict future outcomes based on past behavior. They realize that if patterns are not broken, cycles will repeat. This realization gives them the courage to step away, even when their heart prefers to stay. Furthermore, the empath's deep understanding extends to themselves. After being pushed to their limits, they begin to analyze their own emotional patterns with the same intensity they once used to understand others. They recognize where they ignored red flags, where they overextended compassion, and where they silenced their intuition. This self-awareness strengthens their resolve. Withdrawal then becomes an act of self-education rather than resentment. They are not merely distancing themselves from people, they are aligning themselves with peace. Their energy shifts from external validation to internal stability. What makes this withdrawal so impactful is the contrast. The same person who once responded instantly now takes time. The same person who once listened endlessly now protects their mental space. The same person who once forgave repeatedly now chooses distance without guilt. People feel this shift because they had grown accustomed to the empath's accessibility. The empath was the emotional anchor, the listener, the supporter, and sometimes the silent healer. When that presence fades, the emotional environment changes. Conversations feel different, support feels absent, and the comfort they provided becomes noticeable only when it is gone. In the end, the empath's understanding of people ensures that their withdrawal is not an act of destruction, but an act of transformation. They do not disappear to punish. They step back to preserve themselves. Their insight allows them to exit situations with dignity rather than hostility. This is why their absence lingers. It carries the weight of all the patience they once offered and all the understanding they once extended. The empath does not need to announce their value. It becomes evident in their silence. And when someone who understood everyone finally chooses to understand themselves first, their withdrawal becomes not only powerful but unforgettable. Therefore, the true danger of a fed-up empath is not destruction, it is awakening. They awaken to their worth, their voice, and their purpose. And once a person awakens, they cannot be controlled by illusions. They walk with intention, speak with wisdom, and choose environments that honor their spirit. That is not aggression, that is evolution. And evolution always changes the game.